Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Energy Security in the 21st Century. We are grateful to Honorata from the Warsaw School of Economics for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please use Zoom's Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Honorata, Assistant Professor at the Warsaw School of Economics in Poland. Honorata, over to you.
So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dave, for this introduction, the possibility to being here. So today I'll have the pleasure to talk about the energy security in the 21st century, since this is one of the most important actually issues in terms of the energy policy of each nation, as I think. I believe that to some extent energy security debate has been carried out at, I would say, the, let's say, outskirts of the energy economy. So I'm saying this quite recently during fascinating seminar the Italian affiliate had on the energy security, which was 5th Energy Security Symposium. One of the organizers, Professor Matteo Di Castelnuovo, said that we who are doing the energy security studies, we are the children of a lesser God. And to some extent does something about it, because there's this mainstream on energy security, on energy economics, whereas energy security has been to some extent, neglected. So today I'd like to show you a few actually thoughts on energy security. I've divided my presentation into a few parts. So first I'm going to start with introduction into energy security, showing you why there's so many different actually definitions on energy security, then trying to deliver the reasons for that. And then I'm going to move to Polish supply security perspective, which of course is the closest perspective, obviously, to me. After the presentation, there's going to be, as Dave said, the Q&A session where I'd like to welcome all the questions and comments that you'd like to share with me. So I'm going to start sharing the screen, hopefully. It's going to work. Hope it's visible. Okay, it's visible, but it's not working. Okay, let me just take a second. It's always when you go online, you do have that problems. We've already checked that, and it worked. Okay, so I think that as many people are in this virtual room, probably as many different actually opinions on what energy security might be, we would have. And probably none of that opinions would be wrong. I mean, to some extent, all of us would be true saying, what's energy security? And that's because everybody is coming from different actually countries with different energy scenarios, with different energy backgrounds at the same time. So I'd like to start a little bit differently, maybe not in a very scientific manner. So this is so-called the dark rabbit optical illusion, which was brought by Wittgenstein in the late 19th century. So probably while you're actually looking at that picture, you may see different things. Some see rabbits, some see ducks. The same is with energy security. I mean, under the same phenomenon, under the same name, we tend to see different actually issues. And as Kuhn, one of the most prominent philosophers in terms of science, said, we see the world in terms of our theories. I'd like to convince you that actually what we bring in terms of the theories, in terms of their backgrounds, is what we see in energy security. But there's lots of so-called semantic chaos behind energy security, especially nowadays. And I think that it stems from a number actually of reasons. So firstly, the high level of interdisciplinarity is responsible for numerous definitions. I mean, as you all know, this is the idea that's been researched by both economists, political scientists, engineers, but also lawyers. I mean, each of that scientist types have actually different nomenclature, different words that they use to depict the same phenomenon. And it's natural. I mean, sometimes we do think about the same issues, even though we tend to give it different names. The second reason behind the semantic chaos is connected with a research horizon. So I've observed that a number of times that in numerous papers, either we are looking at energy security in a kind of snapshot view where you look at the moment of time, assessing that phenomenon, saying that it's good or bad. And then there are those works that look at the phenomenon in a dynamic manner, meaning that lots of the attention is devoted to how the phenomenon has changed throughout the time. Not mentioning the fact that there's always, if there's a dynamic perspective, there is always a division into either short-term or long-term horizon. I mean, in economics, we tend to delineate those two aspects by the fact whether the production factors have already adjusted to changes. So in the short term, they do not simply adjust to the changes that are taking place, whereas in the long term they do. However, the question is how long should be the long term in terms of energy investments? I mean, normally in economics, we say that 3 to 5 years, that's enough. Whereas we know from energy economics that actually the investment period, the investment cycle takes more than 5 years. I mean, from a simple oil or gas field discovery through seismological, geological surveys to putting the rig into operation takes 5 to 10 years. So that is why very often we tend to assess the phenomenon by looking at different moments of time and sometimes deriving very specific conclusions, even though they would be a little bit different if you would, let's say, stretch the analysis into longer time horizon. Thirdly, stage of economic development. I believe that this is one of the issues that actually differs and changes the perspective of energy security in terms of different countries. I mean, both in the US, in Europe, in all developed countries, we do have something what we call electrification rate. And this is one of the simplest measures of energy poverty or energy access. So it's for us more than obvious that the electrification rate in industrialized societies amounts to 100%. But again, this is not the case for instance, sub-Saharan Africa regions, where especially in rural areas, this electrification rate is significantly lower. So I'm telling you about this because the stage of economic development changes also the perspective of energy security. For industrialized nations, developed nations, energy security will be mainly about probably reasonable prices of energy. Whereas in terms of developing nations that struggle with energy poverty and energy access, that will be mainly about getting the energy or have it simply available. Last, perceptions. So the perceptions on energy security make it very contextual phenomenon. And that's what Vincer is writing about in his essay on energy security. But here I'd like to touch upon perceptions in a little bit different manner. There's been a really interesting research by Mr. Ćviek-Karpowicz, who proves that what experts believe on energy security is not the same what society thinks. It turned out, he surveyed a number of respondents, and it turns out that society thinks about energy security more in terms of environmental issues, so mitigating the risks that the energy industry brings to the environment, the climate, whereas experts are more focused on supply disruptions, technical issues, and prices. So perceptions, or let's say the fact how much you are endowed with the knowledge on energy issues, also determines how you perceive the energy security. So all in all, that results in a situation when the energy security is a concept without a common definition. So there's been lots of adjectives describing energy security, and all of them are, I would say, similar. Energy security is either difficult concept, elusive, blurred, ubiquitous, complex, remains poorly defined. It has no common interpretation. The exact definition is hard to give as it has different meanings to different people at different moments of time. And here I'd like to stop for a minute because I very often tend to use this crude definition or the description about the energy security to compare the situation of Poland and Germany. I mean, even though these are two nations, neighboring countries in the European Union, they have the similar stage of economic development, yet in energy policy, both of the countries, I would say, pursue different goals. While Germany is with the Energiewende policy, struggling to have the nuclear phase out, Poland is struggling around 2030 to build nuclear power plant, the first blocks. While Germans are increasing supplies of natural gas from a single supplier, in that case, this is Russia, Poland is going into strong diversification on natural gas imports, reducing the share of Russia. I'm giving you that example because two nations, two members of the European Union, similar level of economic development, and yet completely different energy security goals. As Vincer is saying, energy security is not clearly defined. The definition is widely disputed, or the actual definition of energy security not yet reached consensus, or at least as little consensus. As Ang and others have estimated, between 2000 and 2014, there's been more than 100 papers delivering 83 different definitions on energy security. So as a result, we are talking about the same phenomenon, even though not having a common definition. So that is why probably, as said before, as many people there are in this virtual room, as many definitions on energy security. So let's firstly go to probably the most known definition on energy security delivered by Bohai and Thoman in the 1996 and before in their paper in 1993. This is one of those definitions that not only stems from economics, but this is also the one that strongly depicts it, I would say, within the framework of international economies, because what Bohai and Thoman are saying is that energy security externalities are mainly connected with imports. I mean, that's been the discussion within whether the energy security is mostly about the energy that comes from abroad, or maybe that refers also to domestic issues and the way the energy is supplied domestically. And of course, you may have different standpoint on that view. However, the Bohai and Thoman are strictly focusing on this, let's say, external dimension. And they are saying that energy security externalities connected with imports can be broken down into 3 different categories. So they are saying that they may refer to imports volume, imports prices, and military expenditures. I will stop for a second at the last one, because the military expenditures are the ones that actually cannot be assessed in a quantitative manner. Even authors are claiming that you cannot separate, you cannot isolate the cost that the government is actually occurring from maintaining its military presence in the Middle East only for peacekeeping purposes from the costs that are connected with getting an access to hydrocarbons. So that is why those military expenditures are very often omitted in the analysis. Imports volume externalities are mainly divided into direct and indirect costs. Those direct costs are connected with the market power that either exporters or importers can exert. With the exporters, the case is, I would say, at least known in international framework, because the activity of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries have proved a number of times that in some periods of time, at least, the exporters were trying to exert a market power over the importers. Similarly, in the natural gas market, we do have a cartel-like organization, I would say, called Gas Exporting Countries Forum, that aspires to have this similar, at least the same influence over the natural gas market as the OPEC has in the oil market. Personally, I do think that due to qualities of the crude oil, along with its inelastic demand, those 2 organizations, I mean, they are not comparable, just to say. The market power of the importers can be exerted only in one case, and that's when the importers, and that's when we do have a monopsony in the market. So this is a very actually rare situation when it comes to energy resources. So the indirect costs connected with the import volume are connected with the increased prices of the fuel, affecting negatively trade balance, then current account deficit, obviously the balance of payments deficit, and then translated into the currency depreciation, the importer's currency depreciation. As Krugman and Marian and Svensson are saying, there might be, however, 2 cases when this currency will not depreciate. Krugman is giving the example of the situation when the exporters are actually holding the reserves, international reserves, in the currency of the importer. So Krugman is arguing that probably exporters will be doing everything to fight back the currency depreciation. However, Nies and Sweeney have not found any empirical evidence supporting that argument so far, and this is their work from 2006. Marian and Svensson are saying, however, something else. They're saying that if the country is facing high energy imports, of course, at some point, the country will be forced to decrease its energy imports due to high prices, what will result in a situation that the energy as a production factor used for the production of final goods will cause the lack of the final products that were produced with the use of for instance, crude oil. If that's the case, probably increased demand for the final goods that are not available in international markets will drive up its prices, what in a consequence will improve the terms of trade of the importer's nation. So Martin and Spencer are giving this exception to the rule in which in general you would observe deteriorating terms of trade for importers. With the import prices, you will have actually a variety of externalities that range from employment decrease, production decrease, or the lack of protection against fluctuations in raw materials prices, but this is mainly observable in the private sector. So how the energy security has evolved through the time. I think that from 70s up till now, it has significantly changed. So in the 70s, the beginning of the 70s, we have started with the oil crisis that were a landmarking kind of events in the energy security. I mean, at that point, our International Energy Agency was established. Definitely that was and that is a organization that governs to some extent energy markets, but also protects energy security of different nations, so to call. Obviously, establishing International Energy Agency was mostly connected with what we had in crude oil markets. And this is how I would say the whole history of energy security began, I mean, the modern history. However, the 90s brought something different. I mean, with the developed and gradual market liberalization, the idea of demand security popped up. So demand security in micro scale. So once a number of countries, the policy introduced strong market liberalization, the policymakers started to actually think whether changing the supplies of natural gas or electricity will not affect negatively the electricity or natural gas delivery. So that was probably the first time when this thinking about demand have actually appeared. However, our 21st century brought something completely different. So the attention has definitely shifted to natural gas markets, and that's what we strongly and clearly observe. So the supply disruptions in Europe have made this commodity one of the most important, actually, the topics in terms of energy security. Along with that, we have, even though Kyoto Protocol established long before that, we have gradual and steadily developed standards in climate protection to which countries have to adjust. On the other hand, you do have also a strong energy hunger in developing nations who are sometimes not that eager to share the same ideas on the climate protection as developed world. Along with this, you have game-changing shale gas fever. The shale gas fever that started in the US at the beginning of the century and that spread, I would say, across different continents, changed definitely the rules of the rules of the game in terms of the natural gas market. I mean, definitely for the US, that was changing the position from net gas importer into net gas exporter. With Europe, there were hopes that for some countries, similarly, for instance, for Poland, shale gas would be a game changer. However, those hopes, unfortunately, have been abandoned due to a number of reasons. but the shale gas definitely introduced a number of, I would say, qualitative changes also in natural gas markets in Europe. And then we have rising environmental consciousness of the societies, especially in the 21st century. I mean, that altogether resulted in a fact that energy security in the 21st century is not only about the supply, the demand, but also about environmental issues. And as Ang and others have estimated, the environmental aspects in energy security definitions and studies constituted roughly 10% of papers that were issued between 2001 and 2005. Then a few years later, between 2010 and 2013, there's been more than 40% of the papers that were published. So that shows you how a big rise in environmental issues was visible in terms of energy security. So the research that I'd like to share with you today is partial research on energy security perception and energy security definitions. So it's in the form of the scoping review. That's a type of the integrated review. However, it was augmented by several procedures that actually made appraisal of the papers and their synthesis more categorized. The papers were not, for instance, accepted on their first face value. So in the study that I'll be showing, we've researched two the biggest databases, scientific databases. The first one was the Web of Science. The Web of Science is the oldest and the biggest database that was established in 1997 and then renamed in 2014. The second database was the Scopus database, and the Scopus, even though established a little bit later, has a similar as Web of Science number of records, reaching to 80 million. So these are two biggest databases on one hand, and on the other hand, these are two that include social science records. The third one, also ranked as one of the biggest, is PubMed. However, this database is strictly focused on medical sciences, so that is why it's not included in that research. So what was this? How did we do this, and what were the search criteria? So firstly, we focused on, as said before, those two databases, and the search criteria were delineated by the time range. So we started in 2000s, and then we ended our research horizon at 2020. Of course, as the study was carried out in late November 2020, it did not catch all the publications that were delivered in 2020. Of course, it included the early access papers. However, whatever was published, I mean, after the 20th of November, will not pop up in this, will not appear in this research. And as you can see in the charts that are presented in here, we have looked into specific databases. That's Web of Science, and that's also Scopus. However, those two databases were also broken down into let's say economic or social sciences categories. That looked differently in Web of Science and in Scopus. In Web of Science, it's been delineated to economics, business, and management area, whereas in the Scopus database, it was a little bit wider. It showed not only economics, econometrics, and finance, but also It included business, accounting, and management. So this category and scopus was, I would say, described in a more detailed manner. As you can see on the chart presented in your in the right part of the slide, I mean, definitely energy security studies are on the rise. So the 21st century brought numerous publications delivered in the mainstream of energy security research. Interestingly, this pale blue and pale red colors, these are those bars stand for publications in either Web of Science economic area or Scopus economic area. So you can see that actually those publications are incomparably, I mean, the number of publications is incomparably lower than when it comes to those general Web of Science and Scopus databases. So where do we publish? I mean, generally, these are articles, both in Scopus and in Web of Science. However, it's visible that this economic perspective, so in Web of Science economic part and Scopus economic part, articles are even dominating more. That's especially visible in the Web of Science, which is given here with this pale blue color. Of course, the other source of publishing our research results are conference proceedings or the conference papers. However, as said before, articles are the most important parts. So who's publishing the most? And interestingly, in the general databases, you would see Asian institutions and Chinese institutions specifically taking the lead. It's a little bit different when it comes to this economic perspective given in here in the right hand side. Whereas even though you can see still here the dominating position of the Chinese Academy of Science, there's a greater variety, I would say geographical variety of institutions. There's University of Cambridge in here, Russian Academy of Sciences, but also Bucharest University of Economic Studies, Central European University, Cambridge Judge Business School, or the Financial University under the government of the Russian Federation. What I'm trying to say is so that in economic actually area, you do have this greater variety of universities, especially universities from Europe or so-called Euro-Asia. One of the institutions that is also very vocal in terms of energy security research, and you'll see that later on, and this is the Deutsche Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung, which is either in the 11th rank or 12th rank in both of the databases. I'm telling you about this because then in the supply and demand security, there are significant differences, especially with this institution. So demand and supply security. So supply security, that's been something what constituted establishment of the International Energy Agency. Demand security is the type actually of energy security research that popped up quite recently. We've seen that in the first works of Konoplyannik, either or Romanova or Johansson or Dijk. But all of them, these are papers that were, with the exception of Konoplyannik, that were published after the 2010. So how does it look like? I mean, again, in general perspective, you would not see that energy demand security, which is here given with this dark green bar, is prevailing in the research. Rather, supply perspective has dominated energy security research, but something has changed around 2014. I mean, the dynamics in terms of publishing in energy demand security has significantly rose, and that rose that much that in 2011, which is actually the last year keeping the full record of the database, the energy demand security research dominated over the supply perspective. Again, the economics perspective, so the Web of Science economic part and the Scopus economic part are rather silent in terms of energy supply and demand security, just as it was with the general energy security perspective. And apart from the fact that, I mean, those papers and this research is on the rise, you don't see actually specific tendencies in here. So in terms of, again, the most vocal institutions in energy supply and demand security, in the general perspective, again, the Chinese Academy of Sciences takes the lead. By the way, the size of the gray box suggests or resembles the number of actually papers. So interestingly, and while breaking down the energy security idea into supply and demand perspective, more and more of European actually universities appear. So here you have, for instance, Imperial College of London, whereas in the economic perspective, in the demand security, next to Academy of Sciences, there's a University of Cambridge, which takes, for instance, the lead in a supply security perspective. I was like introducing the idea of the German Institute for Economic Research, because here you can see that actually this is one of the most important institutions carrying out their research on supply security perspective. Then where do we publish specifically? With the Web of Science, the most popular title is Energy Policy. I mean, and it has the unrivaled, I would say, position, an unchallenged one. So in each of the research strings, whether that's general energy security, demand or supply security, energy policy has more than 50% share. With the Scopus database, again, the economic part of the database, I would say there's more democracy. So the Journal of Cleaner Production, that's the one that is dominating. However, its share amounts to 11 or 15%. The flagship publication of the International Association for Energy Economics, which is the Energy Journal, has 1 to 2% share in both databases. That translates into roughly 4 or 5 papers or conference proceedings in each database throughout the whole time horizon. Then how, in this situation, the Polish energy supply security looks like? So definitely in terms of the topics that we are actually touching upon, coal industry, coal mining prevails. And that's obvious a result of the natural resource endowment situation in Poland. But again, another important literature string in Polish energy supply security, it's the hydrocarbons market. And again, in here we see especially the energy imports, crude oil or natural gas. And again, we see here that the situation in the research strongly resembles what we used to have in Poland. So when we had the discussion about the shale gas exploration, definitely there were papers that were referring to that topic. Apart from that, there are general discussions on energy security, energy security measures, and different modeling aspects, along with, I would say, perspective, which is not that widely represented on energy technologies. So how does this Polish perspective look like? So probably I would say that there are three most important issues or challenges that Poland has as of now. And in my opinion, they would be referring to the specific energy resources, primary or secondary. So definitely that's coal and the whole idea of coal phase out and transformation. Secondly, there would be natural gas, especially in terms of its imports, and then introducing nuclear energy into the energy mix. You would say why, for instance, renewables missing here? I would say that renewables are a derivative of each policy aspects in here. So obviously you need renewables and you need natural gas because they constitute, they are complementary fuels, especially in terms of wind. However, renewables cause lots of intermittency problems, which, for instance, cannot be safeguarded by fuels such as coal or nuclear power plant. But let me start with describing those Polish energy supply security perspectives by referring to coal. So we are right now in the middle of the discussion when the coal phase out would actually happen. It's been estimated that that's going to be around 2040, 2050, depending on the source. Obviously, the coal production in Poland has decreased significantly over the last years. I mean, the record high levels of 1979, when we had a production on the level of 200 million tons, are not to be repeated. So it's been estimated that in 2020, by different forecasts around year 2000, that we're going to have a production of coal at the level of 80 million tons. However, as of now, a number of estimates are showing that probably that number would amount to 60 million tons. So that shows you how significantly this production has been decreased. I mean, obviously, coal is the most important fuel when it comes to electricity generation, and roughly 80 to 75% of the electricity is coal-based in Poland. Then you have natural gas imports and a policy to diversify the imports structure. I mean, definitely the most important activity was commencing the LNG facility in Świnoujście with the initial capacity of yearly capacity of 5 BCM. Right now, we are in the middle of actually extending the capacity to 7.5 BCM yearly. As of now, the LNG facility works nearly at full capacity, allowing to import not only the Qatari gas, but also gas from US on different contractual arrangements. Apart from that, we do have also a commitment which's been introduced into energy policy that Poland will have the nuclear power plant around 2030. So as of now, we are in the middle of deciding for the location. There are two actually places which are considered or taken into consideration. Quite recently, Poland has also signed an agreement with the US on cooperation in the nuclear industry. What the policy stipulates in form of the in case of the technology that is supposed to be used in Poland, this is pressurized water reactor type generation 3 or generation 3+, and definitely I mean, AP 1000 is the one that meets those criterion. I mean, the problem is that probably, as far as I know, AP 1000 works. There's only one unit working in the world, and this is China. So introducing that into energy mix should improve Polish situation in terms of also GHG emissions. So summing that up, definitely energy security became an important topic, with the economic perspective being a research gap, whether it's supply or demand perspective. Secondly, these are the Asian and specifically Chinese institutions that are the most vocal ones when it comes to energy security research. But one probable explanation behind that might be the fact that in the Scopus and Web of Science database, 23% of the research that was taken into consideration stems from engineering field. So here I would actually look for an explanation behind those high shares of Asian, especially research institutions. The most popular journals when it comes to publishing energy security, that's Energy Policy and Journal of Clean Energy Production. The Energy Journal is also visible in here, however, with significantly lower number of papers. When it comes to investigating this Polish energy supply security perspective, it's visible that it's dominated by the issues that are challenging in Polish energy policy. Of course, this study, as any other, has its limitations that are connected with a methodology, with the way the databases were used. I mean, at some point, we thought about including also the gray literature databases, but not all the gray literature sources can be delineated to a specific time horizon. For instance, with Open Gray database, you can easily do this, and the Open Gray brings something around 200 records when it comes only to energy security. Whereas with the Google search, simple Google search, or even advanced solutions, you cannot stipulate the exact time frame that was of the essence in this particular research. So that would constitute a significant research gap. And it's actually observed that especially the gray literature in the forms of the reports that different international bodies bring are of the essence when it comes to defining energy security. The flagship definition of energy security brought by International Energy Agency is probably the one which is used the most often. So that proves that gray literature search is also an important source in that research. So the duck and rabbit illusion. So a full disclosure in here, I'm one of those that see both, and that's the same with energy security. So the energy security is not only about the supply perspective, it's more and more, especially quite recently, about the perspective of demand. So that is why this probably duck rabbit illusion is quite relevant to describe this phenomenon. But as Thomas Kuhn is saying, I mean, the answers you get always depend on the questions you ask. So I think that it's a good time for the Q&A session. So those of you who'd like to approach me with an email, you can easily find it in here or over the IAE directory. So one of the questions that I very often hear is how actually the COVID affected energy security, and probably this is one of those issues that is very important when it comes to not only energy security but specifically energy markets. So it's been estimated by the International Energy Agency that COVID has significant consequences for producers, specifically because, I mean, some of them, especially those volatile exporters, have problems with getting the oil and gas incomes. And it's been estimated that probably Iraq, Nigeria, and Algeria could have the revenues decreased by roughly 80%. Definitely what's been also observed is, in terms of the energy security, is the decreased demand in oil, gas, and coal. Of course, the crude oil market has suffered or has experienced the biggest turmoil with the demand decreased by 25%, especially in April. But similar tendencies, even though not that strong, were also visible in gas market and coal market. Good side of the COVID for energy security was that probably those extended lockdown policies, they reduce the local air pollutions. And it's been visible that in some areas, especially where the road transport decreased significantly, like by 70 to 80%, the nitrogen dioxide emissions also were reduced. So in Milan, which experienced such a lockdown policy, those nitrogen dioxide emission levels were more than 20% lower than in the periods before the lockdown. Another, I would say, optimistic, because that's how we should also look at this phenomenon, thing is that probably the COVID situation might be the opportunity to revise or reaffirm commitments towards clean energy transitions. Maybe not in every part of the world, but definitely some countries have already made their declarations that they're gonna in a more engaged manner devote to cleaner energy policies. Of course, COVID is not that good in all parts of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. There's been problems, especially for customers. I mean, I've been telling you that the energy security perspective depends on the stage of economic development. And obviously in sub-Saharan Africa, those problems are different than in developed economies. So the COVID-19 definitely negatively affected the customer's ability to pay for the energy services. So there was a need to actually introduce relief measures to for the customers to have the energy again supplied on a stable basis. For the off-grid companies in those areas, that was also a financial challenge, as a number of them have been struggling to survive. So that's how the COVID affected the energy security. I'm curious whether there are any other questions. Okay. Another, I would say, controversial, quite controversial issue is the coal phase out in Poland. So, and that's controversial because, of course, Poland is one of those countries that are endowed with coal. However, in the recent years, Poland from time to time has been net coal exporter, and from time to time it has been net coal importer. The reason is the cost effectiveness of the imports, and we've observed that a number of times that the heating facilities that are on the eastern border of Poland are more eager to use the coal imported from the east because it's like more effective for them in terms of cost than buying that from Poland. Quite interestingly, we have also made an inquiry into this issue with Professor Kenta Karuga from Japan and Professor Katarzyna Stala-Szlugaj from Poland. And we've discovered that actually the prices of coal for heating plants are more connected or more resemble what's going on with the prices in international natural gas markets. So this is a proof that actually the situation is important for Poland. Another important issue when it comes to controversies over the coal phase out is the social aspect. And here, that's the problem, of course, of many coal mines and coal and all people employed in the coal mines. But it's not only the significant number of people amounting to more than 80,000 that are employed in the coal mines, but it's been also estimated that more than this number is employed in so-called neighboring actually services. So a number of estimates are also showing that in some regions of Poland, if the full coal phase out would take place, the unemployment rates would go up to 50%. That is why this very reasonable policy and gradual policy has to be taken into consideration to meet those interests of all the stakeholders. Of course, another problem is the age structure, demographic age structure of the Polish coal miners, and it seems the number of them, these are relatively young people before their 40s as of now. So this is roughly 40% to 45% of all people employed in Polish coal mines. But definitely the time for the coal phase out 2030 or 2050 gives at least a time for a gradual change. Okay. I see no questions in here. So just to sum it up briefly, energy security is definitely in the recent years on the rise. Economic perspective is definitely missing in the research, and the Polish supply security is closely connected with the policy challenges that are relevant for Poland. So the coal industry situation, the transformation, the natural gas import, and the introduction of the nuclear energy into the energy mix. I think that this is it. Rebecca, Dave?
IAEE wishes to thank Honorata Lukaszewska for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you are not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I now officially close this webinar.